Okay, we'll pray briefly and then we'll press on. So, Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to just take a break from the day and to spend this time in history. We trust it won't be just a romantic thing that we're thinking about a wonderful past, but that it will stir us up to live godly lives in our day. Thank you for the library and for all the resources it represents and contains. We do pray that we might be thankful for our heritage and that we might be eager in our own day to serve our generation. Thank you for your servants in the past and all the good that you did through them. Amen. So I'm trusting that most of you, if not all of you, will remember that a month or two back, we began to look at the fundraising trip that this man here, Samuel Davies, the American Presbyterian preacher, made. He was accompanied by Gilbert Tennant, a little bit older, and it's Davis's diary that we have that gives us the most information we have on this particular trip. You might remember that last time we began by talking about what had happened 12 years later when the Native American Samson Occam had come on a similar fundraising trip. That was prompted in part by George Whitfield and was promoted by Eleazar Wheelock, the congregational minister and educator. Occam came, preached about 300 or 400 sermons and raised over £12,000, a lot more than was raised then 12 years before. So that provided the money for Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. And then before Occam, then Davis and Tennant had come on this similar trip, and that paid for Nassau Hall, which is in Princeton. It was called the College of New Jersey at this time, but it's what became Princeton. Of course, Princeton became a great bastion of the Reformed faith from in the following years. So, as I say, Davis kept this diary while he was here. He didn't always keep it quite up to date, but unlike Occam, who sort of started a diary and then abandoned it after a little while, he did follow it through. And so it takes us all the way from June the 2nd, 1653, that's when he started it back in America, through to February the 13th, 1755, which is when he arrived back home again. So there are actually two diaries, one in Union Seminary, Virginia, one in Princeton. But between the two, we can more or less work out what he wrote down at that time. So he left New England on November the 18th, 1753, and arrived on December the 25th. He remained in London then until May the 3rd, when he and Tennant headed north because they knew that the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland was about to take place in Edinburgh. So they were away for 4 months altogether in different parts of England and Scotland. But they were in the capital then for the last few weeks of their time before setting sail in November 1754 and arriving then 3 months later. So it's just over a year, the whole story. And it's been, the diaries have been printed up by a man called George W. Pilcher, an American. Back in the 60s, he did that. And he points out that the problems for Davis and Tennant were that, well, first of all, there was a split in Presbyterianism back in New England. But then also when he came to this country, he discovered that Presbyterianism was riddled with Arianism, and he was more likely to find evangelicals amongst the Baptists and the Church of Scotland than anywhere else. So last time we looked at this, we looked at Davis's preparations, his actual crossing of the Atlantic, and the time that he spent in London fundraising. And so what I want us to do is to begin this time with the decision to leave London and to head for Scotland. So as I say, it was the time of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland drawing near. Davis and Tennant felt that they'd done all that they could in London. And so on May the 3rd, They set out for Edinburgh. They went in a post chase, which was, I suppose, the most efficient means of travelling in those days. Every 15 or 20 miles, there would be fresh horses and so on. Although it wasn't a straightforward journey by any means. In his diary, Davies says this. He says, "We have been under the special guardianship of Providence, both by sea and land, ever since we left home. But never more remarkably than in this journey, we were twice in the most imminent danger of death. Last Saturday near Caxton, I think that's somewhere in Cambridgeshire, by one of the horses becoming unruly and his running and kicking and breaking the shafts, harnessing, etc., all to pieces. And yesterday, by the hostler, man in charge of the horses then, suddenly pulling back the top of the chase while we were in it, which caught Mr. Tennant's head and pulled him back with such violence that he was very much strained and the blood gushed out of his nose. Providence, no doubt, has some important design in these alarming trials. May they prove seasonable mortifications before extensive success, which might otherwise exalt us above measure." So Davies seeking to put a good understanding on things. And then, still in reflective mood, let me give you another extract. He says, "'Tis an honour to be employed in public service, and I have cause of grateful joy rather than complaints. But I never engaged in such a series of wasting fatigues and dangers as our present mission is attended with. And what painful anxieties about my wife, family, congregation, and the success of our applications have disturbed my breast, this heart only knows. I have often walked the tedious, crowded streets of London from morning to evening till my nature has been quite exhausted, and I have been hardly able to move a limb. It was but seldom that I could relax myself in conversation with a friend by reason of incessant hurries. And when I have had an opportunity, my spirits have been so spent that I was but a dull companion. My hurries have also denied me the pleasure of a curious traveller in taking a careful view of the numerous curiosities of nature and art in London. But all these disadvantages have been more than balanced by the success we have had, notwithstanding the ungenerous opposition made against us by the pretended friends of liberty and Catholicism. 'Tis but little that so useless a creature can do for God during the short day of life, but to be instrumental in laying a foundation of extensive benefit to mankind, not only in the present, but in future generations, is a most animating prospect. But I don't know if you keep a diary and whether you write in that style, whether you really open your heart up or whether you just say what happened. But certainly, I've found, especially looking at it again this time, how Davies really opens himself up. And but I'm hoping this will be good preparation for me to read those 3 volumes of his sermons, which I'm afraid still stand on my shelves. But perhaps somebody else will be encouraged to read them as we get to know this man a little bit better. So he's not got much else to say about this 5-day journey from London to Newcastle. From Newcastle, they went to Edinburgh. They went via Preston Pans and via Berwick. Now, you may well be aware that there was a battle near Preston Pans in 1745. So that was some years before. This was during the Jacobite uprising. And in that battle, then, the godly Colonel James Gardner was killed. I don't know if any of you know that name. He was from that area, although I think that's coincidental. The thing is, he was a godly man, and Philip Doddridge, who we'll have much more to say about later on, Doddridge died in 1751, so 3 years before. He had written up this biography of Colonel James Gardner, and so Davies, was very struck. I think he knew the contents of the book. He knew about Gardner. He would later meet Gardner's widow, and it was a very moving experience for him to be there in Preston Pans. They arrived in Edinburgh May the 9th, and Davies was apprehensive about how it was going to go in the assembly. But the next day they met a man called Alexander Webster, minister of the Tolbooth Church, and he was very friendly and full of advice, although he was aware this letter had been sent from Philadelphia by a man called Cross. This is probably Robert Cross. And that was a problem, Webster felt. Also, they'd had lots of collections over the last year, and so he was a little apprehensive. They also met Patrick Cumming, who was again sympathetic towards them. There was also the Hebrew professor James Robertson, who introduced them to his friend Robert Hamilton, also a professor in the university. Again, Cumming had received one of Cross's letters, but they argued their case, Davies and Tennant, and did what they could to raise the funds they intended to raise. By May the 16th, they'd met several more people in Edinburgh. John Gowdy, George Wishart, who was, Davies says, the favourite preacher of the polite in this city. There's a man called James Watson, a man called John Johnston from the Castle Church, and then there was a George Lindsay, who was the minister in North Leith. There was also a Mr. Logan. I haven't found anything else about Mr. Logan, but Mr. Logan was a fine preacher, apparently, who'd never accepted a charge and so remained unordained. But he was a good preacher, and he became a strong supporter of the cause. They all treat us with great respect, Davies says. That day they dined with Webster and with the Lord Provost, George Drummond, who gave them a very friendly reception and promised to do all he could. There was a little bit of time for sightseeing, seeing the castle and the other fine buildings there in Edinburgh. They also tried to find a way to answer this letter that had come from Mr. Cross. Davies preached for Webster on May the 15th, one of his favourite sermons on Jeremiah 31. And then on May the 12th, they heard a man called Robert Kinloch, and they also heard this man Cumming, pretty much in the strain of our fashionable moderns, which I think is a criticism rather than a compliment. They witnessed the opening of the Lothian and Tweedale Synod. Davies, it's fair to say, was rather underwhelmed by that. Alas, he says, there appears but little of the spirit of serious Christianity among the young clergy. May the 18th, he waited on Lord Dromore at his county seat, Dromore House, near Preston Pans. This man then is Hugh, H-E-W, Hugh Dalrymple. He was one of the senior judges in Edinburgh and so on. That evening, Davies received a packet of letters from home, which had his passions in a turmoil once again. The letters revealed how unwell his wife had been, although she'd now recovered, and he really wasn't sure what to think about being so far from his dear wife. At this time, he also visited the MP Gilbert Elliot, who was a lawyer and a member of the Assembly. His brother, Andrew Elliot, back in Philadelphia, had written a rather negative letter about Davies and Tennant, but he promised that he would weigh up the matter as fairly as he could. There's also the minister, George Kay, who was, again, friendly but concerned about this letter from Philadelphia. Sunday, May the 19th, Davies preached to a large crowd in Tolbooth Church, another sermon from Jeremiah 31. He felt he had little tender sense of the subject, but to his surprise, he found that lots of people had been pleased and edified, although some people didn't like the fact that he used notes. That was frowned upon by some. That same evening, he preached for Wishart in the Tron Church on Revelation 1:7. He felt he had a little more freedom this time. After church, he dined with Wishart. May the 22nd, he waited on Hugh Hume. This is H-U-G-H, Hume. Hugh Hume, who was the Earl of Marchmont. And in the evening, he and Tennant then waited on the Lord High Commissioner. So this is the Queen's representative at the Assembly. It was John Hope, Lord Hopetoun, that year. And they also found the Earl of Finlater, James Ogilvy there. They read their credentials, explained what they were in the country for, and they were treated well. They saw some dear friends. I don't know if you know any of these names. John McLaurin, John Gillies. You'll see John Gillies' names in writings on revival. And then John Erskine, who was one of the leading evangelicals in Scotland at the time. His conversation very much refreshed them. They say he looks rather grumpy there, doesn't he? But I think he had some good things to say. May the 23rd, the General Assembly began. Webster preached from Psalm 137, verses 5 and 6, a very masterly oratorical discourse. So again, I'm not sure if that's a compliment or an insult. Hamilton was made the moderator. Tennant then was unable to be there because he'd sprained an ankle. But Davies was there. May 25th, Davies lists most of the speakers then, including Cumming. And there's a Robert Trail there. This is Robert Trail of Banff. I don't think that's the same one. This is Robert Trail, 1720 to 1775. Cross's letter and the old sermon by Tennant. Remember, the Tennant had preached this sermon against people in the ministry who weren't converted. Seems obvious to us today, but very controversial. It was still causing problems anyway. Sunday, May the 26th, Davies preached for Watson at the Canongate Church on 1 John 3:2. Lots of ministers present. He later heard a man called Hugh Ballantyne preach. I think Scotland may boast a greater number of good speakers than any country I've been in. And I believe they're accustoming themselves to speak extempore as being of great service to them in it. That's interesting. So then he drank tea. I think I've got a picture now, yes, of he had tea then with this man called Hugh Blair. I've sometimes seen the works of Hugh Blair. I'm sure they're there in the library. They were joined at the meal with Blair's relative Andrew Shaw, the professor of divinity at St Andrews, and there were others there as well. He also met with John Jardine, who said that he expected the assembly to divide in their sentiments, that is, towards Davies and his project, on the lines of whether they liked Whitfield or not. But he thought that's where the division would come. May 27th, Davies had a sleepless night full of anxiety about the success of his application. He went along to the assembly. There was this professor of divinity from Aberdeen, John Lumsden of Auchinleck. He stood up then. Davies had no idea whether he was going to be in favour or against, but he was in favour, thankfully, and he spoke very much for Davies's project. James McLagan also spoke up for them, and the motion was accepted with none against. And Davies notes that a great number of the nobility and gentry were present. He dined then with William Kerr, the Marquis of Lothian, at George Lord Ross's house, and was treated with all the kindness and freedom of a friend. He says that Lady Ross, the Marquis's daughter, was a very sincere and good woman. He went with the Marquis in his coach to the committee that was appointed to draw up an act in recommendation for a national collection. And the committee left its work then to a subcommittee. I think this is how it goes in Presbyterian circles. At this time, Davies received another letter from his wife that he read over and over and over again, as you can imagine, with the most passionate emotions. How good is God to me in preserving her life, so important to my happiness, notwithstanding of threatening sickness. May the 30th, they spoke with the SPCK. So this is the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, and the Marquis of Lothian was the president. And what they wanted to learn from Davies and Tennant was how they could best reach Native Americans, as we call them today. They'd begun work of that sort. They wanted some help with that. They drew up a letter recommending the college to be annexed to the General Assembly, and then they dined with the Lord High Commissioner, where we had the most splendid entertainment I've seen. It doesn't explain what they had, so I don't know what was so wonderful about it, but they were very good. So he continues in Edinburgh then. This is June the 1st to the 14th, 1754. He says there were 16 ministers in Edinburgh, and there were 2 churches nearby in Leith with 3 ministers. So on June the 2nd, he preached for John Jardine at Lady Esther's. Later in South Leith for Robert Walker. He says that Walker was a most humble, judicious man, said to be one of the best preachers in Scotland. June the 7th, he spent a few hours with Colonel Gardner's widow. This is Lady Frances Gardner, 1700 to 1774, and she gave him an account of her many trials and deliverances. The next day, he dined with Dr. Cumming again and had several hours of free conversation with him. June the 10th, he preached for Kinloch before the Lord Provost and the magistrates. He was very impressed with the way that the magistrates in Glasgow went to church. He later preached for a man called John Glenn at the Little Kirk, or West St Giles, on Psalm 97 verse 1. Spent an evening with Andrew Ramsay and Lady Hume, the second wife of Hugh Hume. He often spoke to Robertson. He also preached in the college church and spent an evening at McLagan's in a society of agreeable young gentlemen who meet for singing hymns and instructive conversation. He was becoming very popular in the place, and he says he met with more Christian friendship in Edinburgh than anywhere in Great Britain. So that's true today. Anyway, he went to Glasgow next. He went June the 15th to the 30th, mostly in Glasgow then, the second half of June then. So 6 churches there. Tennant moved on then from Glasgow to Ireland, which is where he was born, where he'd grown up. So we don't know much about what went on there. But they were both honoured before Tennant left with the freedom of the city of Glasgow. Before leaving Edinburgh, Davies had stayed with John Erskine for a while. For Davies, John Erskine exceeded his reputation for being a hard student, a growing genius, and having an uncommon zeal for the public good. So then it was off to Glasgow, initially with William Ramsay, passing through Linlithgow. They called on John Adams of Falkirk, who insisted that Davies stay with them. He is a most judicious, pious minister, Davies says, and a friend of the liberty of mankind in opposition to the exorbitant claims of church power with the high-flying clergy, which the high-flying clergy have run into. This man's wife was the great-granddaughter of David Dixon. I don't know if you know that name, David Dixon, 1583 to 1663, one of the leading Scottish Puritans. So the high flyers, I think by the high flyers, Davies means those who want to wrest power from the people and put it in the hands of the clergy and the lay elders. And he refers, interestingly, to this man. John Witherspoon, in fact, became a successor at Princeton of Davies, and of course is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. A lot of interest these days in John Witherspoon. I think Kevin DeYoung has done a PhD on John Witherspoon. I think I've got that right. Anyway, at this time, Witherspoon was a young man, and he wrote this, what does he call it, a burlesque upon the high flyers under the ironical name of Moderate Men. Davies thought it was worthy of Jonathan Swift for its humour. And he comments then on the way things were going as far as he could see in the Assembly. He says that somebody like John Owen or Philip Doddridge would have been deposed. They were so Presbyterianised, I suppose, that's the best way of putting it. Again, he notes how extremely low-spirited he is and full of anxieties. He couldn't stop thinking about home, about his family, his congregation back in Hanover. He very much enjoyed fellowship, however, with Adams, and he preached for him in this large congregation, about 3,000 in that congregation. Did that 3 times. Young, who was Adams' assistant, he thought a man of great seriousness and extensive reading. They visited Kirkintilloch, which is where Erskine had been once upon a time. James Stoddart was the new minister, but he was away at that time. The very site of Kilsyth, where there had been a revival, was a tonic to Davies. So in Glasgow, he stayed with Archibald Ingram, a magistrate. He was treated with uncommon hospitality, he tells us. He speaks well of Maclaurin, Gillies again, and John Hamilton, a man of clear judgment and a graceful address. He heard preach an excellent sermon on the love of God in sending his sons to propitiation. He wasn't keen on a man called Cross there, nor on James Sterling, who we thought was a bit taciturn. He also mentions Professor Layman, a very modest, bashful gentleman, but very accurate and judicious, though some suspected him of verging towards Arminianism, who showed him. So this man then showed him, this is a funny comment, they imported some relics, I think they were really, from France. Sorry, my phone is ringing. Nothing I could do about that, sorry. So Davies confesses then that he was unavoidably excited to a sort of popish devotion by the sight of these paintings. I'm sorry. I should have left it. I can't switch it off, I'm sorry. I'll try to do it that way. But there we are. Sorry. Yes. So where did we get to now? Yes, unavoidably excited a sort of popish devotion in me. So I don't know what it was exactly. So but, you can see that danger. So he preached lots of times in Glasgow for Gillies, for Halton, for Hill. Hill had a large communion. They used tents, and there were 23 tables, and Davies served at one of them. While he was in Glasgow, he suffered a lingering fever, he says, often despairing of life. The governor, Robert Dinwiddie from Virginia, was there at the time, and he kindly recommended Davies to friends, particularly to the provost, who was his brother-in-law, and to McCulloch. Oh no, McCulloch, sorry, particularly the provost, his brother, and then his brother-in-law, who was at Cambuslang, a man called McCulloch. And again, Cambuslang saw revival in that period, so he calls it the obscure village, so famous for the late extraordinary revival of religion. He was again encouraged to publish some of his sermons. He had a long conversation with McCulloch about the dissenters in Virginia, particularly their oppression by the government. He believed that Dinwiddie, the governor then, would favour them if it wasn't really just not in his interest to do so. Anyway, McCulloch consulted him about a donation of £200 for the propagating of the gospel among the Native Americans. So that brings us to the end of June, and he then leaves Glasgow. I think he goes back to Edinburgh, and then heads slowly to London. That goes on throughout July into August 20th. So back in Edinburgh, Davies preached for Webster and for Lindsay before leaving on July the 1st. And by this time, they'd become, lots of good friends there in Edinburgh. He mentions a man called William Hogg, a businessman and his family. So he wrote, first of all, to Haddington with a man called Dixon, a serious, devout man from Edinburgh, who assisted my judgment about the propriety and lawfulness of joining in the sacrament with Mr. Gillespie, who was deposed by the General Assembly. This is a reference to the General Assembly of 1752, when Thomas Gillespie of Carnac had been deposed from his pastorate by the Assembly. His friend Professor Robertson was also with them half of the journey. Davies calls him one of the best linguists, especially in the Oriental languages, in Great Britain, and notes his insatiable thirst for knowledge, and that he had travelled far to gratify it. His soul is formed for friendship. In Haddington, he stayed with Provost Dixon, who treated him very hospitably. He spoke with Edward Stedman, one of the ministers there in Haddington, who he says I find is one of the high flyers, but he promised me his friendship in the business of our mission. He went on then to Berwick and Alnwick and Morpeth and Durham and Darlington. I don't know how many of you know those parts of the world. He reached Berwick July the 3rd, where he met John Somerville and John Turner. They both had problems with their congregations that centred on their assistants, which is interesting. Davies also spoke to Thomas Monteith, who was positive. He tried to see John Thompson, minister of nearby Spittal. Thompson couldn't see him, but he spoke to Hatton, the principal man in his congregation, and secured his interest at least. He wrote to Thompson seeking a congregational collection. Next, he was at Alnwick. I must confess, I don't know this part of the world, but you go about 10 miles down the seashore. There's a very good road, and you could see then Holy Island in the distance, is about 3 miles away. Alnwick had two dissenting ministers, John Sayers, who was positive, and John Waugh, who simply wasn't at home. Passing through Morpeth on July the 5th, Davies called on Aitchison, who agreed to make a collection. When he reached Newcastle, he says, interestingly, now you've got to remember this is the Georgian era, not the Victorian era. So he says that when he got to Newcastle, he says, I found a comedy called The Careless Husband. This was written by Collie Kibber some years before. I found a comedy called The Careless Husband was to be acted, and as I apprehended I should not be known, and consequently give no offence, I went to gratify my curiosity, but the entertainment was short of my expectations. That's very interesting way. I think there probably is a sort of toing and throwing on that question, isn't it? So that You know, the George, I've read of other Georgians, and they do things that you think, all right, okay. And then you come to the Victorians, of course, and they were very strict about things. And I suppose that lasts right into the middle of the 20th century. But now we've got a regime more like this one at the moment, and it's got its dangers, but I think it's all very interesting. So he stayed in the Newcastle area for a while. He'd earlier noted that there were 6 dissenting ministers in Newcastle: George Ogilvie, Edward Aitken, William Arthur, James Murray, Richard Rogerson, and Samuel Lothian. He says that the latter two, this is Rogerson and Lothian, were more tainted with Arminianism and Socinianism. But the others were good men, sound men. On July the 6th, he called on Rogerson, Lothian, Aitken, and so on, none of whom were against his mission. He says, now, did I write this down? Yes, he says, my indisposition of body, the dissipation of mind occasioned by constant company, the fatigues and anxieties that attend the prosecution of my mission, and my solicitude about my dear family and American friends have so weakened my body and depressed my spirits that I am hardly able to walk the streets to keep up my parting conversation. I am often so mopish and absent in mind that I am heartily ashamed of myself as making a very ridiculous figure. What would I now give to spend an hour in my study or in the endearments of society with my Chara, his wife, my earthly all? Were I more strongly actuated with the impulses of a public spirit, my labour would be more tolerable. But alas, that languishes in the present depression of my mind, and plagued amid this languor with the vigorous insurrections of sin, I hardly know a truth attested by such long uninterrupted experience as this, that no change of climate, no public character, no exercises, no company, and in a word, nothing that ever I have tried can extirpate the principle or suppress the workings of sin in this depraved heart. So he was feeling very low about himself at that point. He spent an evening with a man called Michael Mingus. I've not been able to find out anything else about this man, but he calls him a very pious gentleman who was once a lawyer. Sunday, July the 7th, he preached for Ogilvie and for Rogerson with some freedom. Although he didn't expect sympathy there, he did find it. Spent the evening with Lothian, who was very friendly, but Davies was sure he was affected by false teaching. They had a long dispute on original sin. This was a real big topic of the time. He says that Lothian espoused the view, which is really the view of Alexander Pope, the poet. And the root of this, Davies says, is in a man called John Taylor. John Taylor, 1694 to 1761, based in Norwich. He meets John Taylor later on. He wrote a book in 1740 called Scripture Doctrine of Original Sin, and it's heretical. It was answered by David Jennings, by Isaac Watts, in part by James Hervey and his Theron and Aspasio, and later on, and a very full answer was given by John Wesley. That was in 1757. But it really laid the basis for what became the Unitarian movement. Davies carried on through July the 12th amongst English and Scottish leaders. When the Right Honourable Henry Riddell, Lord Ravensworth, came to town, he sent for Davies. He'd heard about his mission and he wanted to know all about it. He thought he'd gone about it all the wrong way, but he did give him 5 guineas anyway. Mingus went with, or Davies went with Mingus rather to wait on Sir George Bowes, the MP for County Durham, a gentleman of vast estate. Davies says he took inordinate pleasure, like Hezekiah, he says, in showing off all his glory. It was impressive with all sorts of artifice of the best sort in 18th century England. Artificial mounts rose, valleys descended, verdant walks, pastures, and so on. Davies reckoned his plate was worth about £17,000. So Davies was disappointed. You know, the man gave him 5 guineas, obviously loaded with money. Ravensworth advised that he go to the Bishop of Durham. So Davies didn't know what to do about that. He preached for Aitken and Lothian and Ogilvie on July the 14th. He received another packet from Hanover. He had what he calls a very soft, ingenious letter from my Cara, and her generous self-denial in not desiring me to hasten home till I had finished my mission gave me an agreeable surprise and made me reflect with shame upon my own impatience. Meanwhile, his friend Rogers, who was supplying for him at home, seemed to be getting on very well, as did his brother Wright in and about Cumberland. July the 15th, he actually went to Durham, loved seeing the cathedral, spoke to the bishop, a man called Richard Trevor, a Welshman. He felt he was rather condescending, the Bishop of Durham, but he was still amazed that he was talking to people like this, Davies was. He then rode to Darlington and Northallerton. As he travelled, he read A Short Life of Cromwell, which he found very, very interesting. Lots of references to Cromwell as he goes through his diary. Somebody told him that Scarborough was a place where people went, so he thought he'd make a trip to Scarborough. And he arrived then on the evening of July the 17th and supped with a disagreeable company of young rakes and was very low-spirited. He found a minister there, a man called William Whitaker, a serious old gentleman. I think I've got a picture. No, so that's Scarborough. That's Scarborough, round about the time. I think it's a little bit earlier than when people, it was like not a spa, but a seaside town. People would go. And I think, have I got Whitaker there? No, forget that. I had a picture of Whitaker. Anyway, it didn't go very well in Scarborough. So we went on to Hull. He rode there with a man called Ellis, who he calls the Minister of Cove, which I think is probably a place called Cave near Hull. So this man, Ellis, had been a pupil of Doddridge and had, like many others, imbibed the modern sentiments in divinity. Davies says, the word orthodox is a subject of ridicule with many here. The dissenting ministers here take greater liberties than I should choose. They make no scruple of gaming, attending on horse races, mingling in promiscuous companies on the bowling green, and so on. They also went through the town of Beverley. On Sunday, July the 21st, he waited on Wild Boar, Withers, Cunningham, and Dawson in Hull. Trying again to get funds. That was his aim, and so on. And lots of other information about Hull. I've probably got too much here. July the 22nd, he visited various gentlemen of the established church, but they were all away from home, so it seemed. He heard from Tennant then. Tennant had been at the Synod of Ulster and at the Presbytery of Antrim and had got their agreement to make a collection. And he moved on now to Dublin, but was finding that more difficult. So eventually the ministers of Hull wanted to give something to the cause. And by July the 25th, then Davies was back in York once again. He did a bit of sightseeing in York and did that with a man called John Root, with whom he was impressed. Root he calls a bold, mercurial gentleman. He promised a collection, but Davies was growing weary of promises that didn't actually come to anything. So he moves about then Leeds, Wakefield, Sheffield, Chesterfield, Derby, Nottingham, and visits various people who he's mostly positive about. Sheffield, and so I'm going to have to skip a lot of this. So and he goes down to Derby, he sees this inscription on the side of a church there. She was, but words are wanting to say what. Think what a wife should be, and she was that. So that made him think, of course, of his own wife once again. She was, but words are wanting to say what. Think what a wife should be. That. And she was that. So he carries on. He wanted to go to Bristol, but there's just no time for him to do that. So he carries on down the country in Nottingham. He meets a Congregationalist called James Sloss. They're sort of the Congregationalists there in Nottingham are good old-fashioned believers, but then there's Dr. Samuel Eaton, the Presbyterian, and that's quite a different story. They'd imbibed the newfangled notions, Davies says. So lots of other things. August the 6th, Davies dined with evangelical celebrity John Dean, whose history is very extraordinary. I couldn't find a picture of John Dean, but this is the frontispiece to his true and genuine narrative of the whole uh, affair relating to the ship Sussex, as said to the directors of the Honourable East India Company. So this man, Davies, some years before, 1738, had been shipwrecked, and he published an account of it. And in fact, Davies says he now annually commemorates the event by a sermon. So he'd spent 15 years serving Peter the Great. He'd only split with Peter the Great because Peter wanted to launch a war against the English, and that was a step too far. He was for many years His Majesty's consul at Ostend, and had been at most European courts. He picked up 5 or 6 different languages over the years. By this time, he was around about 80, and Davies says, has from nothing raised such a fortune that he has a very handsome living and has retired from business about 15 years. So the narrative that made him famous was the shipwreck of an East India Company ship, along with its cargo off the coast of Madagascar in March 1738. So it took him 16 months to walk across Madagascar before he found a European ship to rescue him. So he sounds very interesting, man. August the 7th, Davies preached for Sloss to a large crowd, his Jeremiah 31 sermon again. He felt that he lacked solemnity, but he was honoured with the presence of 3 or 4 ministers. After he found some of the rigid Calvinists not pleased with his sermon because it wasn't explicit about original sin, he was a bit disappointed there. But then he doubted if the other side would be very happy with what he had to say either. Success in Nottingham exceeded the expectation. He managed to raise £60. And so he carries on then. Loughborough, Samuel Statham, rather small congregation there. And then he gets to Northampton. I think this is really interesting. So August the 9th, he gets to Northampton. And he's conscious that, Doddridge has died now, 3 years before? And he says he felt the town now had a desolate and melancholy look. I think this is all in his mind, to be fair. The dear remembrance of him engaged my tender thoughts as I rode along and threw me into pensive melancholy. How much has my mission suffered by his death? I think I never felt such friendly sensations towards an entire stranger. So he called on Doddridge's successor, a man called Robert Gilbert, but he found that he was in company. He managed to talk to Gilbert the next day. He found, Gilbert was just as sound as Doddridge, but he wasn't getting half the numbers. And God does send these extraordinary people from time to time, don't they? They're always called the Doctor, but sometimes they are. He went out to Weston Favell to meet with James Hervey, who he knew of through his writings. He notes, I have observed that when I have contracted personal acquaintance with great authors, they have seldom answered the idea I had formed of them from their writings. But Hervey exceeded it, greatly exceeded it. The spirit of devotion animates his conversation. The great modesty and delicacy of imagination adorns it. The scriptures are his favourite topic, and he charms one with his remarks upon their beauties. He also frequently throws out some pertinent quotations from the Latin and Greek classics, of which he is an excellent master. Blessed be God. Oh, I'm sorry. Let's get rid of people. He also frequently throws out some pertinent quotations from the Latin and Greek. Oh, have we done that? No. On the Sunday, what happens on the Sunday? Oh, he preaches in Doddridge's pulpit, so he's very, very pleased about that. The site of his monument, the site of Doddridge's monument, with a very significant inscription, struck my mind with uncommon energy. The congregation had decreased since Doddridge's death, but Davies was not aware that Gilbert preached anything different. He drank tea then with Doddridge's widow, for whom I found a greater friendship than I could decently express. He was prevailed upon to preach in the evening. Many gave him the warmest expressions of their satisfaction and seemed quite revived. Spent the rest of the evening in conversation with Gilbert, naturally grave and reserved, and his assistant then, William Warburton. Next day he went with Warburton. Warburton was a student of Doddridge's in 1741, and then served as an assistant and also at nearby Creaton. Wilkinson was also with them, making applications among the people and receiving about £16. Mrs. Doddridge gave 3 guineas. Davies dined with her and found her conversation full of good sense and piety. Remembering that Davies had actually corresponded with them at one point, she treated him with uncommon friendship. He was surprised that she could talk of her late husband with so much composure, notwithstanding her flowing affections. She told him, interesting, she had never had a more comfortable season than when returning from Lisbon. Remember, they went to Lisbon, where Doddridge died. They were trying to find a warmer climate, I suppose. But she said that she had never had a more comfortable season than when returning from Lisbon on the boisterous ocean after Doddridge's death. On August the 13th, Davies was again with Warburton and spent another hour with dear Mrs. Doddridge, praying at her request before they parted. Though he thought often on her remark that she rejoiced that the dear deceased, she always called him the dear deceased, that the dear deceased was called to the tribunal of his master with a heart full of such generous schemes for the good of mankind, which he had zeal to project, though not life to execute. May this be my happy case, he adds. And so he eventually then got to London. He made a little trip to St Albans, but didn't find Jabez Hirons at home. But really, it was a lovely time of the year, and he enjoyed that. And then the rest of his time, this is August 21st to September the 30th, was really in East Anglia, I suppose we'd say. Went to Great Yarmouth, Chelmsford, Braintree in Essex, and so on. But we've no time really to cover all that. I'm sorry, I thought this was going to be a bit longer than I expected. So he finally gets back to London and then makes the return to America, which we've covered really the last time round. I don't think I've missed anything that I wanted to draw attention to in particular. Where are we? Oh yes, this man William Notcutt he met in Norwich. He'd read printed sermons by Notcutt back in America, so it was great to meet him. He was quite an aged gentleman by this time. And also Reverend Thomas Harmer, about whom I can't remember anything. Who was he? Yeah, I've forgotten. Oh. Anyway, I'll try and print up what I've not included. Yes, back in London. He went to what's the place called? It's gone out of my head. Nobody recognises that, do they? Anyway, Coggeshall in Essex. I was interested to see that. And I think we mentioned these two gentlemen last time. Andrew Gifford and Meredith Townsend, who he met at Stoke Newington back when he was back in London. So that gives you, I hope, a taste at least of Samuel Davies. And as I say, I'm hoping it will stimulate me to read his sermons. But if not me, at least perhaps some of you will get hold of the sermons. Thank you. So I'll leave a little time for questions rather than trying to fill in with more. I could just find out who Thomas Harmer was. Who was he now? It's gone out of my head. I did underline his. Oh, there he is. Thomas Harmer, 1714 to 1788. A friendly, sociable, and ingenious gentleman. His congregation had a fund for occasional expenses, and so they were able to devote that to the work of the college. So this is in Wattisfield. I don't think that's the same place as Wattisham, but this is Wattisfield, a little country village with a large dissenting congregation pastored by Thomas Harmer. Good. Okay. Any questions?